It was the kind of night that feels as if it's holding its breath, where the world lies under a heavy veil of silence, and the moon barely dares to show its face through thick, brooding clouds. My lantern cast only a faint, trembling light against the fog that clung to the ground, blurring the path before me, as if the very earth itself wanted to swallow me whole. I'd nearly convinced myself to turn back. This was ridiculous, all because of a letter. But the words haunted me. "Come to the chapel in the woods tonight, and the minstrel will play for you." The note was unsigned, written in a narrow, almost spidery script, as though the author's hand trembled as they wrote. No name, no reason. But there was something almost magnetic about it, a compulsion that pulled me to this place despite the unease settling like cold iron in my stomach. I'd heard tales. Everyone had. The phantom minstrel, the spirit of a musician long dead, doomed to wander the woods around the chapel, playing a mournful tune that only the doomed could hear. According to the stories, if you heard his song, you'd never leave the forest again. I'd always dismissed it as just another piece of local folklore, the kind of story told around fires on cold nights to make children shiver. But now, as I stumbled forward in the dim light, those tales took on a weight I hadn't anticipated. The chapel loomed before me, a crumbling relic hidden deep within the trees, its stones dark with moss and age. Its narrow, empty windows stared like blackened eyes in the night. Every instinct urged me to turn back, to flee, but I found myself stepping forward instead, my fingers clutching the note in my pocket. Somewhere within, faint but unmistakable, I heard it, a single sorrowful note that drifted through the trees like a whisper, pulling me toward the heavy, weather-beaten doors. The air was colder here, pressing in around me, dense and suffocating. I could feel something watching me, something hidden in the shadows just beyond sight. But that music, it drifted closer, each note hanging in the air, somehow impossibly sad yet chillingly beautiful. I was entranced, my own heartbeat syncing with the melody, as if the sound itself had taken hold of me. And then, the doors creaked open as though beckoning me inside. The music grew louder, filling the hollow chapel with a mournful tune that wrapped around me like cold fingers, tugging me forward, step by reluctant step, until I was nearly at the center of the darkened nave. It was then that I saw him, or rather, something like him. Cloaked and gaunt, his hood cast in shadows, he held a mandolin, its strings flickering in the dim light, his skeletal fingers moving with unearthly grace. He played not as though he wished to be heard, but as if compelled, his entire being focused on the notes that poured out of the instrument, dark and winding. A chill ran through me, rooting me to the spot as the music sank deep into my bones, filling me with a dread I couldn't shake. The tune echoed through the chapel, reverberating in the very stones, as if the walls themselves were singing his ghostly refrain. I wanted to turn, to run from the chapel's shadow-drenched walls, but I couldn't move. Each note sank deeper into me, weighing me down with a hollow, gnawing feeling that I couldn't name. The minstrel's face was hidden by his hood, yet I could feel his gaze, cold and probing, like he was peering straight into my soul. I knew somehow that I was the reason he was playing tonight. He had been waiting. As the music swelled, the chapel seemed to close in around me. The air grew thick, pressing on my lungs, and a dizziness clouded my mind. Shadows stretched and shrank along the stone walls, flickering in time with the tune, as if they were moving in rhythm with his playing. I caught a glimpse of something in those shadows. Faces twisted in silent agony, mouths open in screams that made no sound. They flickered in and out of sight, vanishing as quickly as they appeared, leaving only a deep, pulsing dread in their wake. I tried to focus, to snap myself out of the trance that held me, but it was as though the music had taken root in my body, forcing me to listen. My hands went to my ears, but the melody seeped through my fingers, invading my mind like a slow, creeping poison. Each note felt like it was unraveling a part of me, peeling away my thoughts, my fears, my memories. I could feel the world slipping away, becoming hazy and distant. There was only the minstrel, the music, and a sense of inescapable doom. It was then I noticed the scratches on the wall nearest to me, faint, barely visible in the dim light. But there, jagged letters, desperate, scrawled as if by hands trembling in terror. I leaned closer, squinting in the flickering light, my heart thundering as I deciphered the words. Cover your ears. Silence is your only escape. The words hit me with a jolt of clarity, like a splash of ice water. Silence. Silence was the only way out. The music wasn't just sound. It was something more, something dark and hungry that took hold of those who listened. I glanced back at the minstrel, his skeletal fingers still plucking at the strings, and I realized that he hadn't noticed me reading the warning. His hooded face was turned toward me, yet his gaze was distant, empty, as if he was playing for something beyond me, something that no living soul could comprehend. I forced my hands to cover my ears, pressing hard until my knuckles turned white. The music dulled, muffled but still there, pressing against my palms with an almost tangible force, fighting to break through. I stumbled back, step by agonizing step, watching the minstrel as he played, his movements growing frantic, as if he sensed me slipping away. His head turned slightly and I glimpsed a face, pale, hollow, and fixed in an expression of eternal sorrow, lips parted in a silent lament. I had to get out. I couldn't stay here. Not with him. Not with the music clawing at the edges of my mind, desperate to draw me in. I turned and staggered toward the door, my heartbeat roaring in my ears, drowning out the haunting melody that tried to pull me back. The chapel felt endless, stretching into darkness, each step heavier than the last, as if the floor itself was reaching up, trying to drag me down. But the words on the wall echoed in my mind, anchoring me. Silence. Silence is your only escape. The door was just ahead, slightly ajar, the fog beyond beckoning like a thin, fragile promise of freedom. I moved faster, praying I could keep the music at bay just long enough to get outside. As I reached the threshold, the music stopped abruptly, cut off mid-note. The silence was deafening, thick and unnatural, as though even the forest had gone still, holding its breath in the aftermath of his song. But I could feel it. Somehow he knew I was leaving, slipping from his grasp. I had to keep moving, not daring to look back. As I stumbled through the doorway, my hands still clamped over my ears, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a deep, gut-wrenching certainty that I wasn't alone. The cold night air wrapped around me, but it didn't feel like a relief. Instead, it felt thick, oppressive, as if I had walked from one trap straight into another. I took a few unsteady steps into the fog, still not daring to look back at the chapel. My breath hung in the air, quick and ragged, and every instinct screamed at me to keep moving. But even with my ears covered, I could still feel the music pulsing behind me, faint yet relentless, like the echo of a heartbeat that refused to die. The melody seemed to trail after me, winding through the trees, brushing against me like cold fingers in the mist. It was softer now, but somehow even more haunting, a distant lullaby that called my name. Then, slowly, I became aware of something moving in the fog, shadowy figures shifting just out of sight, flickering at the edges of my vision. I forced myself to keep walking, but with each step, I could feel them closing in. They moved with a strange, fluid grace, their shapes barely distinguishable from the darkness around them. Faces began to take form in the mist. Hollow eyes, mouths twisted in silent screams, each one bearing the same sorrowful expression I had seen on the minstrel himself. They were the lost ones, I realized, the souls that had fallen prey to his song, drawn in by the music and trapped forever in the fog. And now they were reaching for me, their arms stretched out, pale and ghostly, fingers clawing at the air as if trying to pull me back with them. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a run, my hands still pressed against my ears, focusing on the rhythmic thud of my footsteps, anything to drown out the lingering notes that still whispered in the air. But as I ran, the fog grew thicker, swallowing the trees, the path, everything. It was as if the world had dissolved, leaving only the dark, endless mist. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and every time I looked around, I saw the shadows drawing closer, circling me like wolves closing in on their prey. The silence was thick, unnatural, pressing against my skin. But beneath it, I could sense the music. A low, mournful hum, as if the minstrel were playing just for me, drawing me back into his embrace. My heartbeat thundered in my chest, each beat echoing the urgent words scratched into the chapel wall. Silence. Silence is your only escape. But how could I escape when the music followed me, winding through the fog like an invisible chain? Desperation clawed at me. I had to find a way out of the mist, to get back to something real, solid, before it was too late. Ahead, through the haze, I thought I glimpsed a faint light, a flickering, distant glow, like the faint promise of dawn. I focused on it, feeling a glimmer of hope rise within me, and began sprinting toward it, ignoring the shadows that reached out from the fog, their ghostly fingers brushing my arms, my shoulders. I didn't stop, didn't dare look back. The light was growing brighter, sharper, and I clung to it with every ounce of strength I had left. But then, just as I thought I was breaking free, the music returned, louder, stronger, filling the air around me with that same dreadful, sorrowful tune. And this time, it sounded different, as though the minstrel himself were standing just behind me, playing with an urgency that was almost desperate. I froze, feeling the cold breath of the fog against my skin, the weight of countless eyes on my back. The light was still there, but now it seemed somehow farther away, like a distant memory slipping out of reach. I was caught between the promise of freedom and the pull of the music, an invisible force that bound me to this cursed place. I knew I had to keep moving. The faint light was all that anchored me to hope, a tiny pinprick in the sea of fog that felt both impossibly distant and my only lifeline. I took a step toward it, then another, each one feeling heavier as though the ground itself were pulling at my ankles. The music throbbed in the mist, each note sinking deeper into my chest, pushing against my lungs, forcing my breath to come out in shallow, panicked bursts. The shadows were closer now, a dense ring encircling me. They watched me, their eyes dark, hollow, and brimming with an emotion that cut straight to my core, a mixture of envy, rage, and despair. These were the souls who hadn't escaped, those who had once, like me, wandered into the chapel and heard the minstrel's song. I tried to ignore them, but they moved with me, matching my every step as I stumbled forward, the minstrel's melody like a rope tightening around my body. Just as I reached the edge of the faint light, I felt the music shift, growing darker, faster, each note urgent and jagged, like the strumming of an instrument on the brink of snapping. I could feel him now, his presence looming just behind me, an oppressive force that filled the air with dread. I didn't need to turn to know he was close. I could feel his shadow stretch along the ground, long and thin, twisting toward me like a black skeletal hand. The light ahead flickered, dimming, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it would vanish entirely, leaving me stranded in the fog with him. My mind reeled, grasping for something, anything to hold on to. Then I remembered the warning from the chapel wall. Silence is your only escape. But how could I silence something that seemed to pulse in the very air itself? In a final desperate act, I dropped to my knees, digging into the cold, damp earth with my fingers. I took fistfuls of mud, and with trembling hands, pressed it into my ears, blocking out every sound. The fog seemed to press in on me, thick and unyielding, and in that muffled silence, I could feel my heart racing, feel every heartbeat hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The music faded, first to a faint echo, then to nothing at all. For a few precious moments I was surrounded only by silence. Thick, complete silence. The fog receded, the shadows hesitating as if unsure of how to reach me in this soundless space. I could feel the minstrel's gaze upon me, but his power seemed to weaken, his hold loosening as I crouched there, cut off from his song. Slowly, cautiously, I rose to my feet, the mud still pressed against my ears. I couldn't hear anything, not the crunch of my footsteps, not even the beating of my own heart. But the light ahead was clearer now, a steady, guiding glow through the trees, and I focused on it, putting one foot in front of the other, trying to ignore the pressure of the minstrel's stare. With every step I took, the fog parted a little more, the shadows retreating, dissolving into the darkness. I kept my eyes locked on the light, refusing to look back. The silence was heavy, but in it, I felt a strange calm, a sense that perhaps, just maybe, I was finally breaking free. The path before me seemed clearer now, the trees thinning as I drew closer to the light. It glowed steadily, casting a soft, almost welcoming warmth that beckoned me forward. I kept my hands firmly over my ears, the mud smeared across them, drying and flaking, but I didn't dare brush it away. I couldn't let even the faintest hint of that melody slip back in. That music, I realized, was more than a sound. It was a lure, a net cast wide for the unwary, drawing them in, binding them. The fog parted, and I emerged into a small clearing, where the light shone bright and clear from a single, ancient lantern hanging from the gnarled branch of an oak tree. Its glass was cracked, its metal rusted, yet the flame within burned steadily, illuminating the clearing with an otherworldly glow. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought I was safe. But then, out of the silence, I felt it. A change in the air. A chill that crept up my spine, stiffening every muscle. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat, and saw him. The minstrel stood at the edge of the clearing, his figure barely visible in the mist, but his presence as solid and real as the ground beneath my feet. His hood was pulled back now, and I could see his face in the faint glow. A hollow, spectral visage, pale as bone, with eyes that were dark pits of sorrow and hunger. His mandolin dangled at his side, its strings swaying gently, though no sound came from it now. He didn't move, but his gaze bore into me, filled with a strange, almost pleading intensity. I took a step back, but his presence seemed to fill the clearing, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. In the silence, I could feel the urge to listen, to let my hands slip from my ears, to let his music wash over me once more. It would be so easy, so simple, to let go, to surrender to that haunting melody and join the countless shadows that had fallen before me. But something within me resisted. I gripped the edges of my ears tighter, grounding myself in the feeling of my own flesh, reminding myself that I was still here, still alive. I took another step back, inching closer to the lantern. Its warmth spread over me, a comforting balm against the icy weight of his gaze. I'd come so far, survived his song, resisted his pull. I wouldn't let him claim me now. The minstrel's expression shifted, his hollow eyes narrowing with a kind of sad resignation. And for a moment, I thought I saw something human flicker within them. A longing, perhaps, or the faintest hint of regret. He raised his mandolin, his fingers poised above the strings as though ready to play one final note, but his hand hesitated, trembling in the cold air. I turned to the lantern, feeling a surge of defiance, and in that moment, I understood. The light wasn't just a beacon. It was a ward, a boundary he couldn't cross. It was the one thing holding him back, keeping his song at bay. Slowly, I lifted the lantern from the branch, its warmth spreading through my fingers, and I held it high, letting its glow wash over the clearing. The minstrel recoiled, his form flickering, and I could feel his power wane, his presence thinning as the light pushed him back. He stared at me, his dark eyes filled with a pain that cut through me, and for the briefest moment he almost looked grateful. Then, like mist dissipating in the morning sun, he vanished, his form dissolving into the fog, leaving only the faintest whisper of his song lingering in the air before silence reclaimed the night. The lantern's light flickered, casting shadows that danced along the trees, but the minstrel was gone. I stood there for a long while, clutching the lantern in both hands, the silence heavy around me. The clearing felt vast and empty, almost as if the entire forest had exhaled, releasing the tension that had been tightening around it, around me. The mist began to thin, revealing the dark outlines of trees, their branches stretching overhead like skeletal arms. With every breath, the air seemed lighter, less oppressive. The minstrel was gone, or at least, that's what I wanted to believe. My feet felt rooted to the spot, but I knew I couldn't stay here. The light from the lantern was dimming now, the flame within beginning to sputter, and an icy dread stirred in my chest at the thought of it going out completely. I took a deep, steadying breath and turned, choosing a direction that seemed to lead out of the clearing. Step by step I moved, the lantern's light barely illuminating the path ahead, but it was enough. I kept my hands over my ears just in case, unwilling to let any sound, any faint echo of his song, find its way back to me. The trees thinned further, the forest parting, and for the first time that night, I felt the faintest touch of relief. I had nearly reached the edge of the woods, the ground sloping gently down toward the distant shimmer of open fields. My feet felt lighter, my pace quicker, and that terrible weight that had been clinging to me since entering the chapel finally seemed to lift. But as I walked, something gnawed at me, a lingering chill, a sensation I couldn't quite shake. Then, just as the last of the mist dissipated, I heard it. A single note, faint as a breath but unmistakable, drifting through the trees behind me. My heart leapt into my throat, and I turned, instinctively pressing my hands harder against my ears. But there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw nothing. Just empty forest, silent and dark. The lantern's light had almost faded now, casting only the barest glow, and the cold seeped back in, biting at my skin. whispering against my neck like a memory I couldn't escape. I forced myself to keep moving, refusing to look back again, yet each step felt heavier, a creeping dread settling over me once more. Even with my ears covered, I could sense something lingering in the air, a tune, distant and mournful, like the ghost of a melody, just at the edge of hearing. It was softer now, barely there, yet it clung to me, wrapped around me like the thinnest veil of fog, a reminder that what had happened tonight was far from over. As I finally broke free of the trees and stepped onto open ground, the lantern gave a final flicker and went out, plunging me into darkness. I stopped, frozen in place, listening, waiting, but there was only silence. I exhaled, half in relief, half in lingering terror. I had escaped. But deep down, I knew the truth. The minstrel song would always be with me now, a faint hum at the edges of my life, waiting, watching, haunting. And though I was free tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that one day, perhaps when I least expected it, I might hear that melody again. With a shudder, I turned toward home, leaving the dark woods and the minstrel's tune behind, at least for now.